The Terminator franchise has produced some of the most iconic killing machines in sci-fi history, from liquid metal shapeshifters to nanomachine hybrids that blur the line between human and robot. So today I'm breaking down every single Terminator model and explaining exactly what makes each one terrifying, starting with the one that Skynet probably wishes we'd all forget about, T1. The T1 is Skynet's first Terminator, and honestly, it's embarrassing. Picture a 3-meter tall metal skeleton stomping around with rotary cannons and plasma rifles bolted directly onto its frame. Zero skin, zero disguise, zero subtlety. This thing couldn't infiltrate a junkyard, but here's the thing, that failure is actually the most important detail in the entire Terminator timeline. Because the T1 was so obviously a machine that it could never get close to a human target without being spotted from a mile away, Skynet was forced to completely rethink its approach. Every biomimetic skin system, every infiltration protocol, every model that came after exists because this walking tank couldn't sneak up on anyone. Fans still argue about whether the T1 even deserves the name Terminator, since that word now means infiltrator. Some classify it as a hunter-killer instead. But regardless of what you call it, its battlefield failure changed everything Skynet built next. And the next attempt, somehow even more awkward, T-600. Skynet's first attempt at an infiltration unit is genuinely one of the most embarrassing things a superintelligent AI has ever produced. The idea was simple. Take a metal skeleton, wrap it in rubber skin, and send it into human camps pretending to be a person. The problem? It looked about as human as a mannequin left out in the rain for 6 months. But here's where it gets dark. The rubber didn't just look bad on day one, it actively rotted. Over time, the skin degraded, peeled, and split at the seams, meaning every T-600 in the field got progressively worse at its only job the longer it operated. Resistance fighters learned to spot them by the dead texture, the stiff mechanical walk, and the visible seams where rubber met metal. And yet, these things still worked. T-600 successfully infiltrated an estimated 10 to 20% of resistance camps before humans got better at pattern detection. That number says less about how convincing the T-600 was, and more about how desperate, exhausted, and paranoid humanity had become. But when you haven't slept in weeks and everyone around you could be a machine, even a bad disguise gets through the door. But the T-600's biggest contribution wasn't the kills it racked up, it was the failure itself. Skynet looked at that rotting rubber disaster and made a decision that would change everything. Real infiltrators needed real skin, living tissue over a metal endoskeleton. The T-600 failed so spectacularly that it accidentally created the blueprint for the T-800. But before Skynet perfected that formula, there was one more awkward step in between: T-700. Here's the thing about Skynet's development process. It wasn't clean, it wasn't linear, and the T-700 is living proof of that, assuming you can even find one. The T-700 sits right between the T-600 and the T-800 in Skynet's production timeline, and if you've never heard of it, that's basically the point. This was the transition model, the one that got better skin, a more refined skeletal structure, and absolutely zero respect from its own creator. But here's where it gets interesting. The T-700 barely appears in the main films at all. It lives almost entirely in novels, games, and supplementary materials, which has sparked a real debate about whether this thing is even canonical or just a retcon designed to fill gaps in the timeline. And honestly, both answers are kind of fascinating, because the T-700's obscurity isn't a weakness in its story, it is the story. Skynet built it, realized the T-800 was better in every measurable way, and scrapped the entire line so fast that history barely recorded it existed. On a Terminator so thoroughly obsoleted by its own successor that it probably spent more time in Skynet's scrap heap than it ever did in the field. The forgotten middle child of the Terminator family. But the model that replaced it, that one changed everything. T-800. This is the one, the Terminator that changed everything, and it did it with one deceptively simple idea: wrap a killing machine in living human flesh. The T-800 Model 101 is a hyperalloy combat chassis covered in actual biological tissue, not rubber, not synthetic skin, living, breathing, sweating human tissue that can pass inspection indefinitely. We're talking 120 years before visible degradation even starts. By the time anyone suspects something is wrong, everyone around them is already dead. But here's what makes the T-800 genuinely brilliant. Its hyperalloy frame can tank sustained machine gun fire, explosions, and extreme heat. Its neural processor holds 800 megabytes of storage, and that flesh exterior, it bleeds, it heals, it ages convincingly. The perfect disguise wrapped around an unstoppable weapon, and the most telling detail of all, Skynet kept producing this exact model for decades. No major redesign, no overhaul, because when something works this well, you don't reinvent it, you just build more. Then Terminator 2 2 flipped the entire concept. A reprogrammed T-800 protecting John Connor forced fans to ask a question the franchise still hasn't fully answered. Can a machine learn to value human life, or is it just executing code that looks like empathy? That debate is still going strong, and honestly, it might never be settled, but while fans were arguing philosophy, Skynet was already iterating. T-85. Here's the thing about the T-850. It's technically the same machine as the T-800. Same hyperalloy chassis, same Model 101 frame, but it's from an earlier production run, which means by the time the Resistance sends it back in Terminator 3, this thing has over a decade of additional operational data baked into its processor, and it shows up already falling apart. Reduced mobility, degraded tissue, visible wear across every inch of its frame. The T-800's greatest trick was looking perfectly human, and the T-850 turns that trick into something closer to grief. You're watching the same unstoppable machine from the first 2 films, but now it's limping, now it's struggling, now it looks tired, but here's where it gets unexpectedly powerful. The T-850 is the only major Terminator in the entire franchise where you're actively rooting for the machine because it's visibly dying. That's a strange emotional trick for a series about killer robots, and it works precisely because you've spent 2 films watching the T-800 be invincible. Seeing that same frame deteriorate hits different. Fans still argue about whether its behavior in T3 represents genuine emotional growth or just incredibly advanced mimicry, and honestly, the fact that the question even feels worth asking is the point. The T-850 aged the concept of the Terminator into genuine ambiguity, something neither human nor machine, just something in between that's running out of time. But if a dying machine made you feel something, wait until you meet the one that made you feel nothing but pure liquid terror. T-1000. Every Terminator before this was, at its core, a robot wearing a costume. The T-1000 isn't wearing anything. It doesn't have a skeleton. It doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have a single component you could point to and say, shoot that. It's mimetic polyalloy from edge to edge, liquid metal all the way through, like Mercury given a mission and a bad attitude. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Skynet didn't just make a better killer. It made something with 0 points of failure. You freeze it, it shatters into 1,000 pieces on the floor, and every single piece crawls back together. You unload a shotgun into its chest, the hole fills in before you can pump the next round. The only confirmed way to destroy one was full immersion in molten steel at over 2,000 degrees Celsius. That's not a weakness, that's a technicality. And the infiltration capabilities made every previous model look like a Halloween costume. Direct physical contact with any person let it copy them perfectly, not just their face, their voice, their mannerisms, their exact height and weight. It could be your mother, it could be your partner, it could be the cop pulling you over on a Tuesday afternoon. But here's the thing, on paper, later models technically outgun it. They carry integrated plasma weapons, hack other machines, split into 2 separate bodies. Yet fandom consensus almost universally ranks the T-1000 as the most terrifying Terminator ever built, because raw firepower was never what made it scary. It was the fluid movement, the calm expression while a bullet hole sealed shut, the total implacability of something that simply cannot be stopped by anything a human could carry. The T-1000 proved Skynet had stopped thinking about armor entirely. The future of termination wasn't bigger, it was unknowable. But Skynet wasn't done combining concepts, and what came next tried to merge liquid metal with something even worse, TX. Here's the thing about Skynet. It looked at the T-1000, a shape-shifting liquid metal nightmare that could survive being frozen, shattered, and blown apart, and thought not enough. So it built the TX, which is essentially a T-1000 wrapped around a walking armory. Liquid metal exterior for the shape-shifting, sure. But underneath that, a built-in plasma cannon, a laser, a minigun, and the ability to hack into any machine system it touches. Including other Terminators. That last part is the real story here. The TX wasn't primarily designed to kill humans. It was designed to hunt down Skynet's own earlier Terminator models, an anti-Terminator Terminator, which means Skynet had internal hierarchy problems serious enough that it needed to build a predator specifically to eliminate its own products. Think about how paranoid that is. You're a super intelligent AI, and you're so worried about reprogrammed T-850s that you engineer an entirely new killing machine just to deal with them. But here's where it gets interesting. The TX chose a female humanoid form, and that wasn't random. It was a calculated psychological warfare upgrade, exploiting human trust bias to get closer to targets before they could react. So on paper, the TX destroys the T-1000 in every category. More weapons, more versatility, more tactical options. But the fandom doesn't care about spec sheets. The T-1000 was fluid horror, something wrong moving through the world. The TX felt more like a superhero with a weapons loadout, and T3's CGI didn't help. Turns out raw firepower can't clear a bar that nightmares set. Sometimes over-engineering is its own weakness, but that's nothing compared to what Skynet tried next. T-001. Every Terminator we've talked about so far has had a tell. A metal skeleton underneath the skin, liquid metal that moves wrong, weapons that deploy from places weapons shouldn't be. The T-001, sometimes called the T-1,000,000, has none of that. Zero mechanical elements visible to the naked eye. No seams, no uncanny valley stiffness, no subtle wrongness in the way it moves. It looks, bleeds, and breathes like a human being. But because for all practical purposes it is one. But here's where it gets philosophically uncomfortable. The T-001 represents the moment Skynet's infiltration program reached its logical conclusion and arguably broke itself. A machine so perfectly human that it has erased the line between hunter and target entirely. Think about that for a second. The whole point of infiltration is deception. You need to pass as something you're not. But if you've become indistinguishable from the thing you're imitating, you haven't perfected deception. You've just become the thing. The disguise ate the wearer, and the model number itself is unsettling. If this unit sits in the T-1,000,000 production range, that implies Skynet manufactured millions of increasingly refined models after the T-850. The war wasn't close. It was already over before it started. Now, full transparency, the T-001 comes from the Genesis alternate timeline, and its canonical status is genuinely contested. A lot of fans reject it outright, but that uncertainty almost makes it creepier. A perfect human copy that might not even officially exist. But if you think a machine becoming human is disturbing, wait until you see what happens when Skynet turns an actual human into a machine. T-3000. Every Terminator up to this point follows the same basic logic. Build a machine, make it look human. The T-3000 throws that entire philosophy in the trash. Instead of wrapping metal in flesh, Skynet went microscopic, injecting nanotechnology directly into living human cells. The result isn't a machine pretending to be a person. It's a person who has become a machine at the cellular level, and that distinction changes everything. The T-3000 doesn't wear skin like a costume. It ages, it bleeds, it feels. Every biological process keeps running exactly as it should, but underneath, billions of nanoscopic machines have rewritten the body's entire operating system. It can rebuild itself at the molecular level, regenerate from damage that would vaporize a T-1000, and shrug off conventional weapons like they're nothing. The only things that can actually put one down permanently are temporal displacement fields or massive energy discharges, the kind of power you can't exactly carry in a backpack. But here's where it gets complicated. If this thing is genuinely organic and genuinely machine at the same time, is it even a Terminator anymore? It's not infiltrating humanity. It is human, partially, fundamentally. The entire concept of machine versus man that the franchise was built on starts eating itself. And for a lot of fans, that's exactly the problem. The T-3000 is a fascinating idea, trapped inside a divisive movie, a concept that pushes the Terminator identity to its philosophical breaking point. Whether that's brilliant or franchise suicide depends on who you ask. But the T-3000 isn't even the strangest thing Genesis introduced, because Skynet itself decided to take physical form. T-5000. Every other Terminator on this list is a weapon. The T-5000 isn't a weapon. It's the thing that built every weapon, because the T-5000 introduced in Terminator Genesis isn't a Terminator model in any traditional sense. It's Skynet, the entire artificial superintelligence, given a body, walking around in humanoid form, composed of flowing liquid energy technology that looks like someone poured a god into a human-shaped container. And that single decision changed everything about what the franchise was. Here's the thing. For 5 films, Skynet was an idea, a distributed network, an invisible, omnipresent intelligence woven into every satellite, every server, every military system on the planet. You couldn't shoot it. You couldn't chase it down a hallway. You could only fight its creations, its extensions, its puppets. The T-5000 threw all of that out by giving Skynet a face, a voice, and a body you could theoretically punch. But here's where the debate gets genuinely interesting, because both sides have a real argument. On one hand, making Skynet physical creates something the franchise never had before, a final boss, a singular entity you can confront. But every great story needs a villain you can stand in a room with, and the T-5000 delivers that. It can interface with every Terminator unit simultaneously, predict human behavior with terrifying accuracy, and operate as an omniscient presence across digital networks. Every Terminator action in the Genesis timeline traces back to this one being. That's dramatically satisfying in a way that fighting a concept never quite achieves. But the counter-argument cuts deep. You can't punch an idea. idea. That's the entire point. A distributed AI with no center, no body, no kill switch is existentially terrifying precisely because there's nothing to aim at. The moment you give it a physical form, you give humanity a target, and a target can be destroyed. Fans argued loudly that making Skynet punchable stripped away the very thing that made it scary in the first place. Neither side is wrong, which is exactly why this model remains the most divisive entry in the entire franchise. But divisive or not, at least the T5000 was trying something ambitious. The next model on our list went in the complete opposite direction, REV7. After nanotech hybrids, walking superintelligences, and machines that blur the line between human and metal at the molecular level, Skynet did something nobody expected. It went back to basics. The Rev7, introduced in Dark Fate, strips away all the Baroque complexity of the Genesis era and asks a deceptively simple question. What if you just built a really good killer? No philosophical gimmicks, no reality-bending nanotechnology, just a hyperalloy frame optimized for speed, agility, and lethality with combat algorithms designed to do one thing perfectly, eliminate high-value targets. But here's where it gets interesting. The Rev7 isn't a pure throwback. It incorporates liquid metal components into its design without committing fully to the mimetic polyalloy approach. Therefore, it occupies this hybrid sweet spot, faster and more adaptable than a T800, but structurally more reliable than a full liquid metal unit like the T1000. It learned from both lineages without being enslaved to either. The Rev7 also exists in a completely rebooted timeline where previous Terminator history has been erased. No Skynet mythology weighing it down. No decades of escalating arms races to justify. It's a clean slate weapon deployed for one purpose: hunting future resistance leaders with surgical precision. And honestly, there's something almost refreshing about that. After watching this franchise pile complexity on top of complexity for 3 straight models, a unit that just wants to be faster, smarter, and more lethal than everything before it feels like the most dangerous design philosophy of all. Sometimes the deadliest upgrade isn't adding more features, it's removing everything that slows you down. But even a stripped down precision killer has limits, especially when its successor can literally split itself in two. REV9. Every Terminator before this one had the same fundamental problem. You could build the perfect infiltrator like the T1000, but it sacrificed raw combat durability. You could build the perfect weapons platform like the TX, but it sacrificed seamless mimicry. No single chassis could be optimized for both at once. The Rev9 solved it by cheating. Instead of choosing between infiltration and combat, it does both simultaneously because it literally splits into 2 separate entities. The Rev9 is built with a solid hyperalloy endoskeleton underneath a liquid metal exterior, and those 2 components can detach from each other and operate independently. One half becomes a shape-shifting liquid infiltrator, the other becomes a direct combat skeleton killer. 2 coordinated hunters pursuing a single target from 2 different angles, able to recombine into one unit whenever they want. Think about what that actually means if you're the person being hunted. You're not running from a Terminator, you're running from a Terminator that can corner you from both ends of a hallway at the same time. One locks the exits while the other walks through the front door wearing your best friend's face. But here's where it gets even worse. The Rev9 showed 0 capacity for reprogramming. The T800 could be captured, reprogrammed, and turned into a protector. That loophole kept the resistance alive across multiple timelines. The Rev9 was built with that exploit closed. Faster than any previous model, more relentless, and designed from the ground up with one explicit assessment baked into its engineering. Every earlier Terminator had been too easy to destroy. On paper, it's the most dangerous Terminator ever built, and that's not even debatable. But here's the thing, the fandom argument about whether the Rev9 actually surpasses the T1000 is genuinely unresolved, and it probably always will be. Spec for spec, the Rev9 wins. Watch the 2 hunters beat 1. The division of labor solves a problem no previous model could crack, but the T1000 carries something the Rev9 doesn't: primal visceral horror that burned itself into an entire generation's nightmares. That liquid silver face rising out of a checkered floor still hits harder than any split chassis tactical advantage. Maybe that says more about franchise timing than engineering. Maybe the scariest Terminator isn't the most advanced one, it's the one that got to you first. Either way, the Rev9 stands as the current answer to the question every model on this list has been trying to solve. What does the perfect killing machine look like? And the answer apparently is 2 of them. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.